All right. So great to be here. Thank you. I really went down the rabbit hole preparing for this, the artificial, womb rabbit hole. Yes, it exists. It's pretty intense. So reproductive technologies have been controversial in the past and in today. Take, for example, in vitro fertilization. The first baby born through IVF was Louise Joy Brown, born in the UK on July 25th, 1978. The first American born by IVF was Elizabeth Carr, who was born on December 28th, 1981. At the time, part of the population was shocked at this idea of test tube babies, right? And they, predicted, terrible things. Today, this is a standard procedure. Organizations estimate about 12 million children are born each year through IVF. And it has allowed for previously unimaginable options and new family models. But it's still controversial. In February of 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court, you may remember, ruled that frozen embryos are considered extrauterine children under Alabama law, potentially exposing IVF clinics to liability for their destruction. The ruling prompted some fertility clinics in the state to pause or shut down, and it raised concerns about access to treatments of IVF. And many anti-abortion people are very against IVF. The film that we're watching today, The Pod Generation, deals with a different kind of assisted reproductive technology, what's called ectogenesis, or artificial wombs. The Pod Generation is a 2023 science fiction romantic comedy film. That's how it was described somewhere. I can see a little bit of comedy. I can see a little bit of romance, but I would not call it a romantic comedy. It's definitely more sci-fi and maybe a little thriller. It was written, directed by Sophie Bart, who is a French-American film director and screenwriter who has done two previous films, Cold Souls in 2009 and Madame Bovary in 2014. So the Pod Generation features Rachel and her husband, Alvy, who live in New York, in a New York City of the future. Not distant future, but definitely future, where artificial intelligence has saturated many aspects of life. Rachel and Alvy want a baby, but the demands of Rachel's job at a prominent tech conglomerate, Pegasus, leaves no room for a traditional pregnancy. When she receives a promotion, the boss urges her to use a new benefit at the company, the Womb Center, by happenstance also owned by Pegasus, her employer, to gestate a fetus outside of her body in a remote womb, which resembles a large egg, thereby enabling her to remain fully engaged in her work. They characterize the benefit as our hottest perk to retain the best and brightest women. The Womb Center was founded with the overarching goal of countering the global decline in birth rates, which they say is caused by immense physical and emotional tolls associated with childbirth. They claim artificial wombs are empowering to women, enabling them to keep working and to avoid the physical demands of gestation and childbirth. Alvy, a botanist and college professor, resists technology and celebrates nature. Ectogenesis, or embryos and fetuses growing in artificial wombs, has been a topic of literature and philosophy with a range of views of its meaning and its potential, as well as its dangers. Going back to 1932, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World depicted a world in which embryos are fertilized in test tubes, chemically arranged into hierarchical socio-biological groupings, from alphas, who go on to take the most important roles in society, to epsilons, a slave caste, who work in large crematoriums mining phosphorus from burnt human remains. And then they're brought to term in a hatchery with artificial wombs. That was 1932. In the 1970s, radical feminist Shulamith Firestone proposed that artificial wombs could be a tool for women's liberation, arguing that they could free women from the tyranny of reproduction and the oppressive nature of traditional gender roles. They would finally free women to pursue their interests and desires outside of their reproductive duties. Firestone's famous book, The Dialectic of Sex, presented a vision of a future where women could be freed from the biological constraints of pregnancy and childbirth to live with greater equality and autonomy. She argued that women's oppression comes down to biological differences, so she argued we need to get rid of them. And you'll hear that theme argued in the film, that somehow these wombs are going to be liberating and empowering for women. By the way, she also advocated for the abolishment of pregnancy, which she described as barbaric, right? With a radical and uncompromising vision, she advocated for the development of reproductive technologies that would free women from the responsibilities of childbearing, dismantle the hierarchy of family life, and set the foundations for a truly egalitarian society. But even back in the day, there was a lot of pushback to reproductive technologies within the feminist movement. There's been a long history of feminists being skeptical about reproductive technologies and distrusting scientists, doctors, and pharmaceutical companies that promote these technologies. Even the pill, which originally was prescribed at 10 times the current dosage and caused women to have strokes, women organized to say, we need this, we need to do something about this. Women are dying from this medication. And eventually the FDA reduced the dosage level. But then other technologies like Norplant, IUDs, DES, etc., all of these things, there's been a really rocky history with reproductive technologies, and a lot of feminists really resist them and are very skeptical, particularly women of color who are concerned that they'll get targeted by these technologies in eugenic ways. The feminist women's health movement, the Our Bodies Ourselves collective, the natural childbirth movement, all of this took a real skeptical view of mainstream medicine and pharmacological manipulations of women's reproduction. These kinds of debates played out when abortion pills were first developed, and I detail this in my book. Feminists had to convene meetings in the late 80s to get everybody on board with abortion pills because there was a lot of skepticism about them. And so they created what was called the Reproductive Health Technologies Project, which brought everybody to the table with scientists to explain how the technology worked and to convince them that it was safe. It ended up being safe, but they didn't assume that. It was a process to get everybody on board to support the idea of, it was called RU486 at the time. It was a French pharmaceutical to get the campaign going to bring it here. So these kinds of debates, so let's fast forward. 2017, a team of researchers from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia built a fully functioning artificial womb and were able to keep a developing lamb alive for 28 days in a sterilized plastic bag filled with fluid. Here it is. Initially, here it is 20 days later with white wool on it. It revived decades-old arguments such as Firestone. Tubes delivered amniotic fluid, medicine, and oxygen to the lamb's umbilical cord. The team saw positive growth and development in the lamb's lungs, brains, and gastrointestinal tracts. In September of 2023, at a meeting at the FDA's Pediatric Advisory Committee, Dr. Alan Flake, director of the Center for Fetal Research at the Children's Hospital at Philadelphia, said that they had run over 300 lambs in the artificial womb, and the runs are generally remarkably smooth. He said, the technology is robust and stable. The group hopes to soon try a device that's been testing a device called extrauterine environment for newborn development, or EXTEND, in humans for premature babies. So that's what a lot of the artificial wombs are focused on now. If a baby gets born at 23 weeks, you put it immediately into one of these bags before it takes a breath and hook it up to technologies to keep it going. In 2017, when all of this was happening in the media, a commentator in The Guardian, Aratha Prasad, argued, if an artificial womb is created, it will mean that women will be freed from the dangers of pregnancy and create a more equal distribution of labor, with women able to work throughout gestation. It will also give men an essential tool to have a child entirely without a woman, should they choose. It will ask us to question concepts of gender and parenthood. In the current issue, just as I was preparing, of The New Yorker, there's an article about a genetics startup called Colossal Biosciences that is experimenting with resurrecting ancient DNA, including the woolly mammoth. In the article, there was a big paragraph about the possibility of using exogenesis, or artificial wombs, instead of surrogate animals to gestate embryos created from the ancient DNA, because using animals, it just doesn't always work and it's dangerous. So the author, but this was what was really interesting, buried in the article, and I think we see this in the film too. The commodification of reproduction. The author of the article said, such technology could revolutionize human surrogate births, removing the ethical and emotional complications of the practice of surrogacy, not to mention the risk of pregnancy. Then he quotes the co-founder of Colossal, Ben Lamb, saying, that field alone is $100 billion spinoff. He's a like tech venture guy. And so you see the dollar signs, right? The dollar signs. And so I'm not going to play this for you because the technology, but this fake Ectolife commercial went viral in 2022 and everybody thought it was real. And it was about this lab that could gestate these children, and people kind of freaked out until everybody said, War of the Worlds here, not real. But it's a really interesting video. And it really it resonates really well with the movie, The Pod Generation, if you want to look at it at some point. So it's just, if you Google Ectolife artificial wombs, you can find it. So here's a few questions to think about as you're watching the film. Some of the themes that the film raised, at least for me. Certainly central is the tension between nature and technology. And even just what is natural and what is artificial? Can nature be replicated by technology? What are the costs and benefits of artificial wombs? How is technology portrayed as superior to nature? Like artificial wombs are better, cleaner, neater, safer than women's wombs. Themes of work versus parenthood, and whether artificial wombs are liberating to women or empowering to women. Is reproductive technology limiting or oppressive for women, for men, for babies? Does technology increase or decrease our personal autonomy and control over our lives, or do we come to be controlled by the technology? What is the impact of reproductive technology on mothers, fathers, or parents and babies? And what are the dangers of corporate or technological control of reproduction? The very commodification of human life. One thing that kept on resonating for me was all the debates about breastfeeding versus bottle feeding and the history of that, where bottles, when formula was first developed, people started, they got sort of sold on the idea that it was pure, that it was better for babies, that it was liberating for women not to have to breastfeed. And then years later, it went the opposite direction. Breast is best, right? And you're a bad mother if you don't breastfeed, and all the tensions around this. I think is an example of a technology owned by a corporation or corporations that then push that technology in ways that can be both liberating and oppressive for women. So before we watch the film, two small things that really got under my skin watching the film. I want to raise, the first is that the film parrots several myths about reproduction. First is what's called the sperm race myth. And you'll see this. This is the scene where the sperm is actually fertilizing the egg, and the characters treat it as the sperm are racing towards the egg to see who can get there first in the plant. And everybody thinks that's what happens, and it's totally not what happens. This is a false narrative of fertilization, which often portrays the sperm as the sole active agent, reducing the egg to a passive recipient and the female reproductive tract to a mere conduit or racetrack for the male sperms. This narrative, which emphasizes male agency and performance, neglects the crucial role of the female reproductive system and the active selection process that eggs engage in fertilization. The sperm race narrative, where sperm are depicted as actively competing to reach the egg, reinforces traditional gender roles and objectifies both sperms and eggs. The narrative simplifies the complex interactions between sperm, egg, and the female reproductive tract, ignoring the active role of the egg in selecting which sperm the egg will let in. The narrative often omits the importance of the female reproductive tract in moving sperm towards the egg and provides little information about the female orgasm, which is totally important, potentially implying that the sole purpose of sexuality is biological reproduction. So, the other thing that drove me crazy is this depiction of a 7-week-old embryo is what they say it is. This is not what a 7-week-old embryo looks like. Can you see the hand, the head, and the hand? Completely mythological. This is an anti-abortion take on what a 7-week-old embryo looks like. The middle is what the 7-week-old embryo looks like. Do you see how small it is? And do you see how that's what it looks like to the naked eye? That's what a 7-week embryo looks like. It is not a little baby-shaped thing. And so I had to just mention that as well. So final questions to think about. How does the film address gendered power dynamics? How does the film address race? Very important. Is the film feminist? How is the corporation Pegasus portrayed? What do you make of the comments of the CEO of Pegasus in the middle of the final credits? And finally, is the ending satisfying? All right, I'll stop there.